Hey, so for my case study, I looked at the current national reconciliation efforts in Cambodia in the aftermath of the Cambodian genocide. Specifically, I looked at the recent trials of former Khmer Rouge officials in order to understand the way that the construction of a historical narrative in those trials can affect national reconciliation efforts and also society-state trust building in the aftermath of a conflict, or in this case of a genocide specifically. So a bit more on the Cambodian genocide itself. It lasted from 1975 to 1979 and began when the Communist Party of Kampuchea, more commonly known as Khmer Rouge, seized power and established their own regime. During that regime, 25% of the population died from execution, starvation, or disease, and millions more were enslaved on farms throughout the country. Despite the scale of the conflict, though, the vast majority of Cambodians still feel as though they do not possess a clear understanding of what exactly occurred during that period. A lot of the survivors of the genocide only have knowledge of what occurred in their immediate area, rather than on like a national scale. And a lot of those who were born after have little knowledge of what occurred because it wasn't taught in schools. A recent survey stated that only 6% of Cambodians born after the genocide reported learning about it in a classroom setting. So the recent trials of these former Khmer Rouge officials not only represent the first sincere attempt at, on a national scale, of holding the Khmer Rouge accountable, but they're also the first time that conflicting historical narratives are being reconciled and a single coherent narrative of what occurred under the Khmer Rouge is sort of being offered to the broader Cambodian public. And sort of that historical narrative actually has serious consequences for reconciliation efforts. And there's sort of two fields of thought around how reconciliation is impacted by narrative construction. The first is an exclusive or an inclusive understanding of narrative reconciliation, which suggests that reconciliation occurs when several different interpretations of historical facts or events are incorporated into one single historical narrative that sort of is mutually acceptable for all parties involved. And the alternative understanding of narrative reconciliation is a more exclusive one that argues that reconciliation occurs when certain historical events are actually forgotten in order for formerly antagonistic parties to be able to coexist and reconcile. They sort of have to forget certain aspects of the conflict that made them antagonistic in the first place. So I'm going to start with the more inclusive form of narrative reconciliation because that's what's most dominant in the literature on Cambodia right now. So one of the main critiques that scholars have had of the reconciliation efforts in the tribunals is that they fail to include all possible sort of perspectives or interpretations of the Cambodian genocide, but rather focus almost exclusively on one, which is the Khmer Rouge archives. And those archives are sometimes used or often used to undermine the testimony of civilians that come into the tribunals. So while the trials try to nominally include victims' interpretations or personal narratives of what occurred under the Khmer Rouge regime, it sort of fails to actually incorporate those interpretations because it's constantly denying their legitimacy if they can't be corroborated by what's in the archives. And so this sort of means that those interpretations aren't being incorporated into the broader one, and therefore the narrative that emerges from the tribunal can't actually promote national reconciliation because it doesn't adequately reflect what victims remember of the genocide itself. The trial also has been argued to fail to incorporate the narratives of former perpetrators, particularly former low-level Khmer Rouge members. So a recent sociological set of interviews with former Khmer Rouge members in more rural Cambodia showed that those members were reluctant to testify within the court because they felt as though the narrative that was being presented by the court didn't align with their own memories of what occurred. One particular sticking point was the way that it characterized former Khmer Rouge leaders who are often venerated in the communities that they came from for local accomplishments, but frequently demonized in the larger state-produced history because of their actions as members of the Khmer Rouge. And so sort of this disconnection between, or disjunction between the way that local level former Khmer Rouge members view the history and how the national level courts are constructing that history means that sometimes the historical interpretations of former perpetrators are not being incorporated into the narrative that the tribunal is producing, and that means that it will be harder for those former perpetrators to actually be able to reconcile with the rest of their community as a result of that tribunal, because it doesn't adequately represent their own personal views of the history or incorporate those views into its own narrative. But sort of despite the fact that scholars have critiqued the tribunal for failing to incorporate both victim and former perpetrator narratives of history into its own broader historical narrative, the tribunal itself is actually reported within popular surveys to be increasing national reconciliation or promoting it. So directly after the first trial, a survey stated that 81% of the Cambodian population thought that the tribunals were promoting national reconciliation. And a more recent survey stated that 91.5% of respondents believed that the tribunals were positively contributing to present-day national reconciliation efforts. And that second survey was from 2018, after several more cases have gone through as well. Another survey also stated that 82% of respondents believed that the trial was helping rebuild trust in Cambodia, and 72% said that the trial increased their own trust in the Cambodian legal system. So all of these studies are suggesting that the Cambodian population views the tribunal to be promoting national reconciliation and helping to rebuild trust within Cambodia, even though according to both sort of like the scholarly writing and more of the reconciliation theory, the tribunal should be doing the opposite. So this sort of demonstrates the need for an alternative understanding or an additional understanding of national reconciliation, which is where the more exclusive one comes in. And exclusive national narrative reconciliation sort of suggests that forgetting plays a key role in reconciliation and trust building in the aftermath of atrocity. And a lot of this is built on the theories of Renan, who argued that the act of forgetting of violence plays a key role in constructing and preserving national identity. And so history can actually pose a threat to national construction, as it highlights past violence that national identity sort of demands be forgotten. And this idea has sort of been built on in more recent literature as well, with the introduction of the idea of chosen amnesia, in which sort of on a local level, amnesia is used as a coping mechanism that allows formerly antagonistic parties to cohabitate by remembering to forget certain aspects or events of the conflict. And so it's important to note that this amnesia is chosen and not coerced. But you can sort of see aspects of this possibly playing out in the tribunals. As a concept, chosen amnesia hasn't been used frequently in the literature on the tribunals, but when you're looking at, for example, who the tribunals are actually holding accountable, it's almost exclusively higher level officials, despite the fact that within the current Cambodian government, there are several lower level officials from the Khmer Rouge who are still sort of working within the government today, which could suggest sort of an aspect of chosen amnesia there, and that the government is trying to forget sort of the Khmer Rouge history of some of its own members in order to reconcile on a national level, sort of by putting all the accountability on these higher level former Khmer Rouge officials and ignoring sort of the actions of lower level Khmer Rouge officials. And so sort of the question that I leave or come out of the end of my literature review with is why do Cambodians view the tribunals as being sort of conducive to national reconciliation while much of the academic literature does not? And if their view of reconciliation stems from an amnesia about the conflict itself, to what extent is that amnesia actually chosen? Because the literature that does exist on what's being forgotten about the tribunals seems to be attributing a lot of the act of forgetting to the government rather than to the people themselves, which could suggest that their amnesia is more coerced than it's actually chosen by the people. And if it is being coerced, to what extent can that actually be conducive to reconciliation within the society or with the state itself? Okay, thanks.